Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, November 3rd, 2025. Happy Election Eve. Today we are going to be taking a look at my 2025 election forecast. On your screen right now are a lot of races that we are going to be taking a look at today. The New York City mayoral race, California's Proposition 50, Virginia's governor race, lieutenant governor's race, attorney general's race, as well as the New Jersey governor's race here. It is Election Eve, and I'm super excited to actually release what we expect to see on election night in about 24 hours. I will be doing a live stream. If you're interested in watching, I'd encourage that you do so. We'll be going through the results through the evening as we start to see the results pour in. Probably will end around the time that California's Proposition 50 is wrapped up. Notoriously, though, the state is very slow at capturing vote count. We know that from the Secretary of State, who's been quite resistant to any type of substantive change in the Secretary of State's office. But really what I'm focusing on today is a lot less about, how we expect the results to come in hour after hour, but rather what we can expect to see as the results are confirmed in each of these individual races. So we are going to go in order, as you see on your screen right now. New York City's mayoral race is going to be the one that we talk about first. We're going to go to California's Proposition 50, jump over to Virginia afterwards, and then finish off in the state of New Jersey. Now, the reason why I wanted to start off with New York City is because this has been a race that I felt like we have been seeing far more news as of late in comparison to what we've seen over the past few months. I think what has really piqued my interest about this city in particular is that Mamdani has practically maintained this dominating figure in the state and city since his victory in the June primary, where he upset everyone and defeated Andrew Cuomo in that first round and substantively rechanged the electorate that we're working with within this city. And we are starting to see it emerge again. I've been seeing a lot of headlines, and New York City is great in terms of reporting early voting data. Really gives us, on the election analysis side, time to digest some of this information that many states just simply will not release, in some cases until after the election is tabulated and as the results start pouring in. And in many cases, these Board of Elections are radio silent, not in the city of New York. And with it, it has provided substantial context in understanding, one, how many people are actually voting when it comes down to partisan breakdown. The Democratic Party obviously trouncing Republicans when it comes down to early voting, which we can already expect is going to benefit Mamdani in the city, but not to mention that just across, the city itself, it is Mamdani who does tremendously well in all of the early voting data. He's breaking the records from 2021, and when you take a look at the amount of young voters that are turning out, you are seeing that Mamdani effect in full force, where every single age group is seeing an overestimation from what the 2021 numbers were, which means at face value, everybody's turning out more. But to the degree that you'll find it, right, relative to the 2021 numbers, you're seeing that young voters from ages 18 to 29 are in a substantially higher portion of the turnout, market here for the early vote, which could also translate to higher vote share in the general election on Election Day set to take place tomorrow, as we saw that it wasn't Election Day vote that turned around the primary for Andrew Cuomo, and in almost every single way, Mamdani's win was pretty much calculated before the votes had been fully cast. And we saw on Election Day, it only contributed to the lead that Mamdani had. Everybody said that it would really narrow up his margin, and evidently that was not the case. And so looking at what we can see too, all of the data suggests that Mamdani is going to do quite well. I think there has been this pipe dream from Republicans and those aligned with Andrew Cuomo being sold on this idea that Donald Trump's last-minute endorsement of Andrew Cuomo is going to benefit him in this race, that there's going to be such a big realignment within the Democratic Party and this complete rejection of Zohran Mamdani, when you just simply aren't seeing it across the city, especially a city that feels very inspired by Mamdani. Now, Eric Adams might be out of the race, and that's the one wild card here that, really changed the race in some ways in the final weeks. Didn't really do much, though. It changed it insofar that it reduced the number of candidates from 4 down to 3 and really made Curtis Sliwa the subject of this massive pressure campaign to get him out of the race. Obviously, he was never going to drop out of the race. He even went so far as to say that he'd rather be tortured, his words, not mine, than endorse Andrew Cuomo in the New York City mayoral race. So really, we knew that was never going to go anywhere, and evidently, the numbers are still in Mamdani's favor. I think from everything that I've seen, I think that the early voting data is clear, the trend lines are clear, even if the race is more narrow than I think some Democrats would have hoped for. The race ultimately will end up with one clear and decisive victor, and that is Mamdani. in the city of New York. We're going to start off by saying that Mamdani wins the election here in the city of New York. I'm going to jump over and paste in this, background here, but Mamdani's going to do well. I mean, we're going to find that he is going to win this race. Let me go ahead and make the font size a little bit bigger here. That way it's more standardized across the board, but Mamdani's going to win. And I think that we're going to find that this margin here is actually going to be quite substantial. I think that what we have found is that, the Democrats are, one, going to be very interested to see exactly what this margin breakdown is going to be. My take here is that it is probably going to be Mamdani who ends up beating out Andrew Cuomo by probably around 15 points, right? I think what we're tracking here is that if the data is correct and our understanding of it is right, then Mamdani's probably going to clock in at around 51%. Cuomo's going to be at 36%, and Sliwa is going to fall in very far behind at roughly 13%. And I think you're going to see that is what gives Mamdani the decisive victory here. That's not the margin. Let me copy and paste this over here, but the margin here is going to be D plus 15%, a pretty decisive victory, if you ask me, across the board, and one that I do think is going to usher in a mandate of sorts for Mamdani in this race. And so as we move on, I just want us to make a note that New York City is probably going to have a lot of this data very early on. We're probably going to see a lot of it dumped all at once, and probably around, this time next evening at a few hours, we'll probably get our final results across the race. But I think Cuomo's going to come in second, Sliwa's going to come in a distant third, and even that combined coalition, I'm not adamant, is enough to take down Mamdani, who I do think clears that 50% mark as you get through the voting tabulations in the state. The next race we're going to take a look at is the state of California, Proposition 50. Now, this is a proposition that a lot of voters on the left have felt very excited about in the final weeks leading up to the actual election day, as the early voting data has shown Republicans getting trounced across the state, especially as California Republicans announced quite literally less than a week ago that they were giving up efforts to try to combat the Democratic Party's pushback against Texas's redraw in the state of California. Proposition 50 was already in a good position given that Kamala Harris won the state by roughly 20 points. It's a safe Democratic state and has been for decades on end, and to see the fact that Republicans initially said they were going to spend $100 million in the race, they were going to get all of these high-profile Republicans out there to drive up turnout in opposition, and they were going to get Democrats on their side. Not only did that not happen, but even their Republicans didn't turn out. They couldn't raise $100 million. They raised $7 million instead of $100. Kevin McCarthy had to lead the effort there with Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had not been in office, since the 2010s. And then you found that Kevin McCarthy, who left office on his own accord, but probably would have been subject to the redraw here, even himself, in Prop 50, as the map is set to find a new leader for many of these Republican districts. The point is, that Proposition 50 has probably been one of the best cases for Democrats, as we've seen in terms of not only just congressional redistricting, but also just ballot efforts. This is one that I do think, given that 15 years ago, it was Democrats who passed the proposition that implemented the Independent Redistricting Commission in the state that now is being sought to be overturned by the same voting populace that ushered it in less than 2 decades ago, under Obama's first term. And so to see that happen in real time, it is a change not just in the way that Gavin Newsom and Democrats at the top are interacting with present-day politics and pushing back against Donald Trump's second administration. It is entirely the voters, too, who feel, in many cases, I think, a moral obligation to put aside their feelings around gerrymandering and Democratic governance in the state and ushering in a new congressional map that benefits the Democratic Party on the national stage. And what I think we are going to see is that in the state of California, it is going to pass probably by a very substantial amount. Do I think it passes by more than Kamala Harris? Probably not. But the yes vote is going to be that secured winner, where you're going to find that, it is that state that gives the Democrats the upper hand. I don't really like this font. I'm going to go ahead and change it over to whatever it is. But here it is. Yes is going to pass the predicted winner mark. I do believe that you're going to find that it is, again, going to be largely in line with what we saw for Kamala Harris. I think you're going to get right under there. I think it's going to pass, yes, by 17 percentage points. I think it thinks that I'm trying to do a little bit of math here. Unfortunately, Google Sheets, that is in fact not the case. But I think the breakdown is going to be pretty clear-cut. You're going to find that it's going to pass across the state here, probably by a pretty substantial amount. I think you're going to get to around half margins. But what I've always found to be quite interesting about California, too, is that what we have seen in terms of Democratic resistance to Donald Trump, I think you have found it to be some of the most engaged most engaged and enraged, arguably, too, electorates that we've seen across the country who, Republicans try and say that they're going to push back, whatever it is, across the state. I think we have seen, finally, not only just from the Dem Gov, not just from the Dem legislature, not just from the Dem Attorney General who are, suing Trump, pushing back against him and changing the maps here. But I do think that this is going to be, base camp for understanding Democrats who have gone from being more passive, more, not as oppositional to the GOP as Democrats would have liked them to be. In California, I do think you've seen a very substantive change that explains why Newsom's approval rating is higher, why 75% of those voting yes report to the media that they are voting yes, not to benefit Democrats, not to change the maps just to help their political party, but to push back against Trump and give Republicans a taste of their own medicine. I think that's where we're at across the state. And I think that does a service, I think, at least to some degree, to the Democratic Party on the broad scale about finding an example or a great state that is willing to push back against what the Democrats are seeing on the national stage, what Republicans are trying to do across the board here. And I think that you're going to find that the state of California is going to be a great example of a state that pushes back against the president. So, I'd say, we're going to get to a point where yes is going to pass. It's going to be a pretty substantial margin. It's one that I think is going to come up short of beating Kamala Harris. I do think there are some Democratic holdouts. You even see it in the state legislature. Some of those progressive Democrats are the ones not leading the charge. Very obviously not. They're not going to be as outspoken against the Republicans. But you are going to find that maybe it is some of those Democrats who say, you know what? I'm not fully on board. I'm going to stick to my guns here. I'm going to say that it's wrong to do a gerrymander across the state. But I do think that a lot of Democrats are equally in recognition that, it's not the fairest thing to do, but simultaneously, Republicans are being unfair everywhere else. And so there are going to be some progressive holdouts. I don't think it's going to be that substantial, though. You're going to see this pass probably around 59% to 41% across the state. But I think that's what you're going to see is that yes is going to, trounce no in this state. But to the degree that it passes Kamala Harris, not fully convinced, but I think you're going to get right up there. And I think that's a major win for the Democratic Party, given that some of the early data might have suggested that it might have failed across the state of California. So that's it. 2 states, New York City, practically a state right larger than 38 states in the country, but 8.3 million people. California's Proposition 50, yes, is going to pass there. Let's take a look at the biggest state, I think. Unfortunately, we're not doing the House of Delegates race. If you're interested in looking at a forecast that I trust and think is quite substantial, you can actually take a look at State Navigate. They do a great breakdown of their expectations in the Virginia House of Delegates. I'll link it in the bio down below or in the description box down below, but we're not going to focus that on today's video. I didn't have enough time to actually go through on a seat-by-seat basis and break it down, but I did have time to take a look at the Virginia governor's race, lieutenant governor's race, and attorney general's race as we go into the final stages the day before the election. Now, Jay Jones is the attorney general candidate who you might have heard his name all around the Beltway media and the mainstream media as you see that his text messages were leaked by a Republican in the state House of Delegates, where he served and is currently serving as a Democrat from a district there, where text messages leaked that were very scandalous. Everybody universally rejected it, and it was something that many people felt might be damning enough that Abigail Spanberger, who we will discuss in just a moment, is expected to do tremendously well in the state of Virginia, that result might not go as well for the Democrats as they would have hoped. We'll talk about it, but that's the one that I think we're going to spend the most time on, just simply because we know how Virginia's governor's race is going to go. We've known it for quite some time. We're probably going to see Abigail Spanberger do very well in that state. And so I do think it's a bit difficult to some degree to do the attorney general's race, knowing that it's going to be so vastly different than the other 2 races in this state. But let's go ahead and get started with the Virginia governor's race. As I said, Abigail Spanberger is going to win the governor's race by a very substantial amount. I mean, I think that she's going to be up across this state probably by about 11 points, which I think is noteworthy, not just because Kamala Harris won Virginia by a margin here of roughly 6 points, but because Biden, as the best performing Democrat in Virginia, I think going back all the way to Lyndon B. Johnson, I'll have to take a look at the last time, Virginia was a double-digit state. We'd have to go back to, 1964. Even then, Lyndon B. Johnson won it by 7. And so, Joe Biden was the best performing Democrat in Virginia in decades on end, over half a century. And I think, I do adamantly believe that it is going to be Abigail Spanberger who exceeds that margin and wins very well across the state. Early voting is up with Democratic-leaning turnout. Every single poll we've seen in the recent, timeline in the Virginia governor's race has been quite good. The announcement that they're going to be moving forward with a redraw across the state also stands to reason that Democrats feel very comfortable. Oftentimes, they would not engage in anything this last minute unless they felt they had a substantive enough majority and a large enough voting bank that they could feel comfortable calling this very early on, even though it might enrage some swing voters. Clearly, if the margin is too large, there's no reason. If Virginia is a reliable enough Democratic state, you don't have to worry about that. Strong support for independence. You're seeing that, Abigail Spanberger has done very, very well across the state, has been leading consistently by double digits here in the state of Virginia. I really think she's in a great position. That is a race I have felt comfortable calling for quite some time. I think you're going to find that the margin here is going to be roughly about 55% for the Democrats to 44% for the Republicans here, for Winsome Sears in the state of Virginia, who's right now the lieutenant governor, will be nothing in months' time. So, Virginia governor's race call. Democrats are going to win that one. California's Proposition 50 going to pass probably by a similar margin to that of Kamala Harris in the last cycle. Mamdani's going to win in the city of New York. We're finding the Democrats are on a strong pathway here. But what's happening in the lieutenant governor's race and attorney general's race? Well, I said earlier that I felt that the lieutenant governor's race was going to be one that's disaligned from the attorney general's race, but also in a way I think a little bit more disaligned than the governor's race. I think for a while, we've known that these races roughly run together. But all three races have found themselves with vastly different margins depending on the data points that you use. When you look at the Virginia governor's race, this one has been pretty much set in stone. But as it stands for the lieutenant governor's race, that race has found itself polling about 5 to 6 points closer on consistent average in comparison to the governor's race. Now, I don't know if that is attributed just simply to lower name ID. I think that's a huge factor, right? Winsome Sears, who has been proven to be one of the most least electable Republicans in the state of Virginia, was carried across the finish line by her governor candidate Glenn Youngkin in 2021, not because she was strong and that voters liked her, but because they liked the guy at the top of the ticket and wanted to align one political party across the state, and that is what drove Winsome Sears across the finish line. And so as much as I do believe the lieutenant governor's race is absolutely more competitive, I simultaneously think that what we've seen in terms of turnout, the base and constituency here in the state of Virginia, I'm not all that convinced John Reed, who has also had his fair share of scandals, gets that much closer to the lieutenant governorship in the state. So what I do think we're going to see is that Democrats are going to win this one. I think Ghazala Hashmi is going to win this race by a margin here of roughly 8 points. I think you're going to see it a little bit closer. I can imagine it, just as, the lieutenant governor's race was closer in 2017 and 2021. But my final estimation here is that Democrats are going to turn out. They're angry, they're enthusiastic, they want to get to the ballot box and elect Democrats, especially in a state like Virginia that's been directly impacted by federal funding freezes, the government shutdown, Doge layoffs. I mean, everywhere you look, it's going to be very hard to find a voter that doesn't know someone, at least personally, who's been affected by the actions of the Trump administration. And given John Reed has not distanced himself enough from that administration, I don't think it's going to be that easy for, these candidates in specific, John Reed and Winsome Sears, to get that much closer to winning their elections, even if Virginia at, core might not be as solid of a Democratic state as it once was in 2020. It's certainly walking its way back, given the disaffection with the president of the United States. And so that leaves me to the Virginia Attorney General's race, and then we'll get into New Jersey in just a moment here. The Attorney General's race is the most interesting. I think by metric point and by data point is fascinating, to say the least. But Jay Jones has been welcomed back into the Democratic ticket. He spoke at the rally with President Barack Obama just 2 days ago. I mean, Jay Jones, who was largely pushed away, and Abigail Spanberger said on stage that voters can vote their conscience and make a decision as to who they want him back, and now he's back campaigning with the Democratic ticket. I think for a while, Democrats felt that this race was a done deal, that they were no longer going to be able to win their race because of where they stood and how much voters had changed their minds, seemingly, overnight. But what has stood out to me as something that I think has been quite interesting in the state of Virginia is that in this Attorney General's race, the polling is telling a very different story depending on those who have voted already and those who intend to vote. The average here says Jason Miyares is going to win this race. But one thing is clear. He cannot cross that hurdle of 48%. Vote Hub, Real Clear Politics, Decision Desk HQ all have him at 47.5. I don't believe that days before an election, where both parties have been spending millions of dollars advertising their candidates, that 8, 9, 10% of the electorate is undecided. I don't believe that there's that many voters out there who have not made a decision. What I do believe, and I think you'll find this in the early voting data, is that of those who have already voted, very little party splitting from those who have voted for governor for Democrats, lieutenant governor for Democrats, and attorney general for Democrats. And granted, those who are the most engaged and partisan often do vote early. But at the end of the day, I think there's a factor here. We talk a lot about the quiet Trump vote, and I think that's very much a proven phenomenon election after election, maybe not in 2024, given that the polls said that Kamala Harris would only win 2 out of the 7 swing states, and she won none of them. But looking at the Virginia Attorney General's race, the data is saying Republicans are going to win it. But I'm hesitant. I think that there is certainly a reality in which Jay Jones wins the Attorney General's race, not because voters condone his behavior, but because they would rather have a Democrat where they can disagree and condemn said behavior than a Republican they think might be aligned against the interests of their constituents. I mean, it is obviously going to be a very difficult decision, I think, to even make a call on this race, given how competitive we think it's going to be. I do think it's going to come down to the wire and will probably be even closer than the New Jersey governor's race. But if it is true, in fact, that Spanberger is going to win by roughly 11 points, it is really hard for me to see that 1 out of 5 voters for Abigail Spanberger are going to change their minds on the Attorney General's race, given that roughly 0 to 5% actually have of those who have already voted thus far. Many of them who openly knew about this scandal. And so I think where we're at is that this race here is going to be probably the most competitive. If I was to call this race a week ago, I think that, I would have been of the opinion that Jason Miyares probably was going to eke by and narrowly win in this race. I don't know if I agree today. I think Jay Jones is going to barely win. I even prepped this, before to actually have a Republican victory in the Virginia race, because I did think that the Attorney General's race was one that the trends weren't great for the Democratic Party. But much of it seems to have been mitigated as of late. The data was a lot better for the GOP than it is now, and very high-quality pollsters, Republican internals, Emerson College, too, which has been remarkably accurate in the 2025 cycle, are telling us that Jay Jones is going to win. And I do think that as it stands today, I do believe there are enough quiet Jay Jones voters that by the time you reach the ballot box and count all the votes in the state of Virginia, he could very well win across this state by a very narrow amount. I mean, you're talking roughly half a point, if that, right, in favor of the Democratic Party. And so I think you're going to get, roughly 50.2% support for the Democrats, 49.8% for the Republicans. I think this one is going to be exceptionally close. And I think the vote share here is going to be down to the wire. Let's actually make this 0.4. I think you can round up and estimate what I'm actually trying to say here. But the point is that it's going to be a very close race. It's going to be one that I think is going to take hours for us to actually get a victor in. But I do believe that in the same case we have seen before, with very bad candidates in the past where scandals have plagued them 1,000%, they have been carried across the finish line by those at the top of the ticket. And in 2025, I do not believe that, it's going to be enough party splitting that Jay Jones lose the Attorney General race by a notable amount. If anything, I mean, this is really a toss-up. You're talking 55% odds. But if I was to make a stance today, my argument is that Jay Jones wins the Attorney General's race, even as it stands to be probably one of the most unpopular things possible. But I do think that it's something that we could see happen on election night and tomorrow evening. And guess what? In 24 hours, we will know. The final race we're going to take a look at is the state of New Jersey, one that I think has been really dominating much of our political conversation, despite being a state that Republicans have not won on the presidential level since George H.W. Bush in 1988, when it voted for the GOP by 13.6%. And since then, New Jersey has been a blue state, and reliably so, at least up until 2024, when Kamala Harris won the state by 5.9%. But that actually explains a little bit of my reasoning and understanding about the state. She won the state in a presidential cycle where Donald Trump was winning 7 out of the 7 swing states. The state itself swung by 10 points to the right, but in 2025, I don't imagine the state will be as conservative as it was in 2024. Now, that isn't to say that some of those voters who would self-identify as liberal and make up a more liberal part of the electorate wouldn't vote red. This is also a case where Jack Ciattarelli, who is able to balance, I think, quite well, the support of the president as well as a unified set of support, not just from Republicans, but he's winning over independents pretty constantly across the state. I think the data has been very clear. It is a close race, no doubt about it. Mikey Sherrill should be doing a lot better, and under a normal Democratic wave year, this would not even be a question. But Jack Ciattarelli has changed this race in a way that capitalizes on what Donald Trump did in the last election. And that was make New Jersey, for all purposes, a swing state. Now, I don't think that Mikey Sherrill is going to lose this race, and I do think that we can pretty much say that she's probably going to win it. I think that, that's where I feel comfortable. I think you're going to see a clean sweep tomorrow night on election night with the Democrats winning everything from New York City mayor to California's Proposition 50 through Virginia and in the state of New Jersey. But the question I think that will help determine, the future of competitiveness in the state of Virginia is largely going to have to do with the fact that, the margin here will define if it is possible for Republicans to actually do well in the state. If Trump is losing it by 6, and that stands to be the best performance for the GOP in recent memory, then maybe it isn't all that within reach. If it can't even be cracked or come close to cracking in an environment where you have a very strong Republican, well, maybe New Jersey isn't really the focus of the future of the Republican Party. Now, Mikey Sherrill, I do think something that we underestimate here is that there will be a lot of voters out there who, are going to be inspired and enthusiastic enough to turn out for Mikey Sherrill just simply because they're angry with Donald Trump. Not in the same way that I think Spamberger wins in Virginia, but I do think Mikey Sherrill wins the New Jersey governor's race primarily on the fact, yes, she's popular, and yes, she's an overperformer in her district, but I do think that Donald Trump is doing the heavy lifting. And that's by angering more and more voters in the state of New Jersey as a state that didn't even vote for him in the first place. The margin here is what I've struggled with for some time. I think I've looked at it back and forth and come to understand that, this is a state where maybe a year ago, right after the election, I would have said Democrats are winning it by at least 10. But that's not where we are. This is a state that the Republican Party has made significant inroads in, and I don't think it's going to be as, contentious as Republicans would have hoped. But I do think it is far more than Democrats would have hoped. And so I think where we're at is that as it stands right now, Mikey Sherrill wins the governorship and wins across the state probably by roughly, 6 points. I think it's going to be nearly identical to the margin that, Kamala Harris won by. And we can actually say I think it's going to be a slight improvement, but it's certainly going to be a competitive state. I think just for aesthetic purposes, I'm going to add, zeros to all of these percentages just so we can make it a little bit better. But the point is that we're going to say that the Democrats are probably going to win this race by roughly 7 points, which means it would be a slight uptick relative to the last election in a way that I think is substantial. Not enough to rule it out as a state that Republicans cannot win in the future, but I do think enough to say that in 2025, the GOP did not get as close as they did 4 years ago, and that's still a good sign for the Democratic Party. And so that brings me to a final roundup of what my forecast says. Republicans are not going to win any of these races based off the data that we've been presented with, and I think that there were times where it felt like the Republicans might. But I don't know if that's today's day and age. The American public is angry with Donald Trump, and they will take it out on him any way they know possible. Every single time we've seen a special election in the states of Florida, Iowa, Virginia, Arizona, Democrats have made consistent overperformances, enough so that the average overperformance for Democrats in special elections is 12 points nationwide. For context, the average overperformance relative to Hillary Clinton's performance in 2016, around this time 8 years ago, was about Democrat plus 6. A vastly different national environment. And while I do think there were times where New Jersey governor's race and the Virginia attorney general's race looked quite bad for the Democratic Party, and I think the same can be said at some points about California's Proposition 50, the rest were quite safe the entire time, I don't think that's where we're at. And I think as we go into the final stages of this election, the final few hours of today, going into election eve, the Democrats are in a good spot. And I don't think much is going to change between now and 28 hours from now as these votes get tabulated and the results start pouring in. Virginia, New Jersey, California, and New York City all stand to be in a good position for the Democratic Party as it stands today. Not as expansive as I think they might have hoped in some of these states, but certainly dominating victories in states like Virginia, a shock one that I think they might not be expecting in the Attorney General's race, as well as a solid redraw in the state of California, green-lighted by a massive amount of voters. The Republicans and Democrats might felt initially that race was going to be more competitive, all of them. I think Democrats have a clean sweep tomorrow night, November of 2025. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. Make sure to tune in to tomorrow's live stream. It'll be taking place roughly around 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.